Hi, I'm Zoe Brennan, and for 28 years I believed my sister Natalie knew what success looked like. She had the corner office, the designer suits, the corporate salary that made our parents beam with pride at every family gathering. Meanwhile, I spent my days elbow deep in clay, turning earth into art in a cramped studio that smelled like dampness and dreams deferred. When she looked at my hands, permanently stained with ceramic dust, she saw failure. When she visited my little shop in Portland's Hawthorne district, wedged between a vintage bookstore and a kombucha brewery, she saw embarrassment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. And on that rainy Tuesday in October, when I excitedly showed her the custom wedding set I'd spent 3 weeks perfecting, she finally said what she'd been thinking all along. Zoe, this little hobby of yours is honestly pathetic. When are you going to get a real job? What she didn't know was that her boss, Marcus Henley, had been quietly watching my work for months. And what neither of us expected was that by the end of that week, he'd be shaking my hand and saying, "Welcome aboard, partner." The October drizzle painted Portland's streets in shades of gray that matched my mood perfectly as I unlocked the door to Clay and Soul. My ceramic studio tucked into a narrow storefront that had previously housed a failed yoga studio, a short-lived vintage clothing boutique, and before that, a coffee shop that couldn't compete with the Starbucks 3 blocks over. The rent was cheap because the space was awkward, with exposed pipes running along the ceiling, and a floor that slanted just enough to make you question your balance after a long day. But it was mine, every imperfect square foot of it. I flipped on the overhead lights, their harsh fluorescent glow revealing the organized chaos that defined my world. Shelves lined every available wall space, crowded with pieces in various stages of completion. Some waited for their first firing, others for glazing, and a precious few sat finished and ready for pickup by customers who had trusted me with their vision. The air carried that familiar earthiness that clung to everything I owned, a scent that had become as much a part of me as my fingerprints. My pottery wheel sat in the center of the main workspace, surrounded by tools that told the story of 7 years spent learning my craft. Some were expensive purchases from art supply catalogs, others were improvised solutions born from necessity and a tight budget. The bucket beside the wheel held clay scraps that would be recycled into new possibilities, because waste wasn't something I could afford, financially or philosophically. The back room housed my kiln, a temperamental beast that I'd bought secondhand from a retiring art teacher. It required coaxing and prayer in equal measure, but it had helped me fire thousands of pieces over the years. Next to it stood drying racks loaded with my latest creations, including the wedding set that had consumed the better part of 3 weeks. That commission had come from a young couple planning their spring wedding, their eyes bright with the kind of hope that made my chest ache in the best possible way. They wanted something unique, something that would tell their story through ceramic and glaze. I'd created a complete dinnerware set for 12, each piece thrown by hand and decorated with a subtle pattern that incorporated elements from both their family's heritage. The bride's grandmother had been a gardener, so delicate vine motifs wound around each room. The groom's father was a musician, so barely perceptible musical notes danced through the glazework when the light hit just right. It had been challenging work, the kind that pushed my technical skills and required multiple test firings to achieve the exact color palette they'd dreamed of. But seeing their faces when I'd shown them the finished pieces made every moment of frustration worthwhile. They'd held each bowl, each plate, as if they were handling precious artifacts, talking about which relatives would sit where at their first Thanksgiving as a married couple. That was the satisfaction that corporate types like Natalie couldn't understand. It wasn't just about making objects, it was about creating vessels for memory, pieces that would outlast the people who used them. When I threw clay on the wheel, I wasn't just shaping earth and water. I was capturing moments, emotions, the weight of human connection. My sister had never understood this. From the moment I'd announced my intention to pursue ceramics seriously, she'd treated it like an extended phase, something I'd eventually outgrow when reality set in. During my early struggles when I was living off ramen noodles and working weekend shifts at a garden center to pay rent, She'd made it clear that she considered my choices naive at best, self-destructive at worst. "You have a college degree," she'd remind me during tense family dinners, her voice carrying that particular brand of sisterly disappointment that cut deeper than anger. "You could get a real job tomorrow if you wanted to. This pottery thing is just an excuse to avoid growing up." What stung most was that our parents seemed to agree with her assessment, though they were gentler about expressing it. They'd visit my studio with forced smiles, making polite comments about my artistic phase while clearly hoping I'd eventually come to my senses and join Natalie in the corporate world that made sense to them. Natalie worked for Henley and Associates, a mid-sized marketing firm that specialized in brand development for local businesses. She'd climbed their hierarchy steadily, earning promotions and pay raises that she mentioned with practiced casualness at every family gathering. Her office overlooked the Willamette River. She drove a lease vehicle that was replaced every 3 years, and she wore clothes that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She represented everything our parents had hoped their daughters would become: financially stable, professionally respected, following a path that made sense to people who'd grown up believing security came from paychecks and retirement plans. I represented the alternative that made them nervous, the daughter who'd chosen passion over stability, creativity over conformity, uncertainty over the predictable trajectory that had defined their own lives. The tension between these worldviews had been building for years, like pressure in a kiln that would eventually find release. That Tuesday morning, as I carefully arranged the wedding set for photography, I had no idea that the explosion was about to happen. I'd invited Natalie to see the finished pieces because, despite everything, I still craved her approval. Some part of me believed that if I could just show her work that was truly exceptional, she'd understand what I was building here. The wedding set represented my best technical work to date, and I was proud of it in a way that made my chest feel tight with emotion. She arrived during her lunch break, stepping carefully around puddles in shoes that probably cost more than my wheel. Her hair was pulled back in the kind of severe bun that suggested important meetings and deadlines, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned whether her choices were valid. "Sorry I'm late," she said, checking her phone as she entered. "Marcus had us in back-to-back strategy sessions all morning. You know how it is." I didn't know how it was, but I nodded anyway, leading her toward the display area where I'd arranged the wedding set on a cloth-covered table. Natural light from the front windows caught the glazework perfectly, highlighting the subtle interplay of colors I'd spent weeks perfecting. "This is what I wanted to show you," I said, unable to keep the excitement from my voice. "It's for a couple getting married in May. 3 weeks of work, but I think it's some of my best stuff yet." Natalie approached the table with the kind of careful attention she might give to evidence in a crime scene. She picked up one of the dinner plates, holding it at arm's length as if examining it for flaws. Her expression remained neutral, professional, the same face she probably wore when reviewing marketing proposals. "It's very earthy," she said finally, setting the plate down with unnecessary care. "Very handmade looking." The words hit me like cold water. Very handmade looking. As if the evidence of human hands in my work was somehow a defect rather than the entire point. "That's the aesthetic they requested," I explained, trying to keep my voice level. "They wanted pieces that felt personal, connected to the maker. The slight variations from piece to piece tell the story of the process." She nodded absently, already losing interest. "I'm sure your customers appreciate that rustic charm. It's very Portland, very artisanal." The way she said artisanal made it sound like a diagnosis. I waited for her to say something else, something that acknowledged the skill required to create uniform pieces by hand, the weeks of testing needed to achieve the exact glaze effects, the mathematical precision hidden beneath the organic surfaces. Instead, she checked her phone again. "Actually, I should probably head back soon. We've got a presentation to the Thornfield Restaurant Group this afternoon, and Marcus wants to run through the materials one more time." The Thornfield Restaurant Group. I knew them by reputation. They owned half a dozen upscale establishments around the city, the kind of places that served small plates on expensive dinnerware, and charged accordingly. "Sounds important," I said, though what I really wanted to ask was why every conversation we had seemed to end with her work schedule taking precedence over whatever I was trying to share. "It is actually. If we land this contract, it could be huge for the firm." Marcus thinks it might lead to a partnership track for me. She paused, looking around the studio with what I'd learned to recognize as her assessment expression. Which is why I keep wondering when you're going to make a change here, Zoe. There it was, the conversation I'd been dreading, the one that seemed to lurk beneath every interaction we'd had for the past 2 years. What kind of change? I asked, though I already knew where this was heading. Look, I know you love this pottery thing, but you're almost 30. At some point, you have to think about your future, real stability, retirement savings, health insurance that doesn't make you choose between doctor visits and groceries. She gestured around the studio as if it were evidence of my failure to launch into proper adulthood. This is fine as a hobby, but as a career, Zoe, this little hobby of yours is honestly pathetic. When are you going to get a real job? The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a failed firing. Pathetic. Not struggling, not impractical, not even misguided. Pathetic. Something shifted inside my chest, a hardening that felt like clay transforming in the kiln. All the years of defending my choices, of explaining my passion to people who couldn't understand it, of pretending that her subtle dismissals didn't wound me, crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. I smiled, not the forced smile I'd been wearing through these conversations for years, but something genuine and unexpected. You know what, Natalie? You're absolutely right. She blinked, clearly not expecting agreement. I am, complete. This whole thing, I gestured around the studio, is exactly what you say it is. Her expression shifted to something that might have been relief, as if she'd finally gotten through to me after years of trying. I'm glad you're finally seeing. There are tons of opportunities out there for someone with your education. You could probably even get something at Henley and Associates if you wanted. Marcus is always talking about how hard it is to find good people. The irony of that statement would become apparent soon enough, but in that moment, I just nodded and continued smiling. I'll definitely keep that in mind, I said. Thanks for stopping by, Nat. I know how busy you are. She gathered her purse and coat, looking pleased with herself in a way that made my teeth ache. I'm really proud of you for making this decision, Zoe. Mom and Dad are going to be so relieved. After she left, I stood in the quiet studio for a long time, staring at the wedding set that had gone from being my proudest achievement to a symbol of everything that was apparently wrong with my life. The afternoon light had shifted, casting different shadows across the pieces, revealing new details in the glaze work. That evening, I called Riley Torres, my closest friend and the only person who understood why I'd chosen this path. Riley ran a small gallery in the Pearl District, specializing in local artists and makers. She'd been one of my first supporters, featuring my work in group shows and connecting me with customers who appreciated handmade ceramics. She said, Riley's voice carried the indignation I couldn't quite muster for myself. Pathetic. The exact word she used was pathetic. I was sitting on the floor of my apartment, a converted loft above a comic book store that smelled perpetually of old paper and possibility. My hands were wrapped around a mug I'd made during my second year in the studio, back when I was still learning to center clay properly. It was slightly lopsided, the glaze uneven in places, but it held tea and fit my hands perfect. That woman wouldn't recognize real art if it hit her in the face, Riley said, which, by the way, I'm seriously considering arranging. The thing is, maybe she's not wrong. Maybe I am just playing house with clay while the real world passes me by. Stop that right now. Riley's voice went sharp with the kind of authority that came from years of defending artists against a world that didn't value their work. You're talking about someone who spends her days creating logos for companies that sell things people don't need. Meanwhile, you're making pieces that will be part of families for generations. Which one of you is doing pathetic work? She had a point, but doubt is a persistent thing. It settles into the spaces between confidence and ambition, growing stronger in the dark hours when success feels theoretical and bills are undeniably real. I just keep thinking about what she said about stability, about having something to show for all these years. Zoe, listen to me. Last month alone, you completed commissions for 3 families, sold a dozen pieces through the gallery, and had that article written about you in Portland Monthly. You're booked solid through the holidays. If that's not having something to show for your work, I don't know what is. The Portland Monthly article had been a surprise, part of a feature on local artisans who were keeping traditional crafts alive in a digital world. The photographer had spent an entire afternoon capturing my process, from throwing clay to opening the kiln after a fire. Seeing my work presented that way, as something worthy of documentation and celebration, had felt like validation I hadn't realized I was craving. But Natalie hadn't mentioned the article. Despite the fact that our parents had shared it on social media with proud captions, despite it being displayed prominently on the studio's website, she'd never acknowledged it. Instead, she'd continued to see my work as an extended hobby that I'd eventually outgrow. Maybe that's what hurts most, I admitted to Riley. It's not just that she doesn't understand what I do, it's that she doesn't want to understand it. Some people can only measure success in terms they recognize, Riley said gently. Corporate ladders, salary figures, titles that impress at cocktail parties. They can't see value in work that feeds the soul instead of just the bank account. We talked for another hour, Riley's voice a steady counterpoint to the doubt that Natalie's words had planted in my mind. By the time I hung up, I felt more grounded, more certain that my path was valid, even if it wasn't conventional. But as I got ready for bed that night, brushing clay dust from my fingernails and washing the day's work from my hands, I couldn't shake the echo of that single word, pathetic. It followed me into sleep and colored my dreams with images of empty galleries and silent studios. The next morning brought one of those crisp October days that made Portland feel like the most beautiful city in the world. Sunlight streamed through the studio windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits above my workbenches. I had 3 pieces to finish firing and a consultation scheduled with potential customers who wanted a custom tile installation for their kitchen backsplash. Normal work, the kind that filled my days with purpose and my bank account with enough to keep the lights on and the rent paid. Not the life of glamorous excess that Natalie enjoyed, but something that felt sustainable and deeply satisfying. I was centering clay on the wheel, preparing to throw a set of bowls for a regular customer, when the studio phone rang. The landline was something I maintained mostly for business calls, since my hands were often too dirty to handle my cell phone. Clay and Soul, this is Zoe, Ms. Brennan. This is Marcus Henley from Henley and Associates. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. My hands stilled on the clay, sending it off-center and requiring me to start the centering process over again. Marcus Henley, Natalie's boss, the man whose approval seemed to define her sense of professional worth. Not at all, I managed, wiping my hands on my apron. How can I help you? I'd like to schedule a meeting, if that's possible. I have a business proposition that I think might interest you. A business proposition, from the head of a marketing firm. My mind immediately jumped to the most logical explanation. He was offering me a job, probably at Natalie's suggestion. She'd gone back to the office yesterday and told him about our conversation, about my apparent readiness to abandon ceramics for something more practical. What kind of proposition? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. I'd prefer to discuss it in person, if you don't mind. Are you available this afternoon? I could come to your studio around 3 if that works for you. The clay was definitely ruined now, sitting like a gray lump on the wheel while I tried to process this unexpected development. That should be fine. Do you know where to find me? I do indeed. I'll see you at 3. The line went dead, leaving me staring at the phone and wondering what I'd just agreed to. Part of me wanted to call Natalie and ask what she'd told him, but a larger part resisted the urge. If this was about a job offer, I'd hear the details soon enough. I spent the rest of the morning in a state of distracted productivity, finishing pieces that required minimal concentration while my mind churned through possibilities. By the time 3 o'clock arrived, I'd convinced myself that I was about to be offered a position at Henley and Associates, probably something entry-level that would require me to start over in a field I had no passion for. Marcus Henley turned out to be nothing like what I'd expected. Instead of the corporate suit I'd imagined, he wore dark jeans, a cotton button-down and leather shoes that looked comfortable rather than expensive. He was probably in his mid-40s, with graying hair and the kind of relaxed confidence that suggested success without the need to advertise it. Thank you for seeing me on such short notice, he said, looking around the studio with genuine interest. I've been wanting to visit for some time. You have? He nodded, walking slowly through the space and pausing to examine pieces on the shelf. I've been following your work for several months now. The article in Portland Monthly was what first brought you to my attention, but I've been keeping track since then. This was not the conversation I'd expected to have. Following my work, The Thornfield Restaurant Group, he said, picking up one of my serving bowls and turning it over to examine the maker's mark on the bottom. We pitched them a complete brand overhaul yesterday, including custom dinnerware for all their establishments. They loved the concept, but they had one specific requirement. They wanted pieces that felt authentic, handmade, connected to the local arts community. He set the bowl down carefully and turned to face me. They want your ceramics, Zoe, all of them. 6 restaurants, complete table settings for each, serving pieces, specialty items, the works. It would be the largest commission order your studio has ever handled. I felt like the clay I'd been working with that morning, suddenly knocked off center and requiring complete reconstruction to find balance again. I don't understand. How do they even know about my work? Marcus smiled, and for the first time, I saw something that looked like genuine warmth. Because I've been showing it to them for weeks, every meeting, every presentation, I've been building a case for local sourcing and authentic craftsmanship. Your pieces were the centerpiece of our pitch. The implications were starting to sink in. This wasn't about a job offer. This was about my work, my studio, my supposedly pathetic little hobby being valuable enough to anchor a major marketing campaign. But there's more, Marcus continued. The Thornfield contract is significant enough that Henley and Associates is looking to expand our capability. We want to add a permanent artisan consultant to our team, someone who can bridge the gap between corporate clients and the local maker community. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He paused, watching my face carefully. We want you, Zoe. Not as an employee, but as a partner. Your studio would become the crafts division of our firm, maintaining complete creative independence while gaining access to clients and contracts you could never reach on your own. The room felt like it was spinning slightly, the way it sometimes did when I stood up too quickly after a long session at the wheel. A partner? Full partnership, equal voting rights, profit sharing, the work. You'd keep your studio exactly as it is. Continue taking private commissions, but you'd also have the backing and resources to take on projects like Thornfield. Projects that could establish you as the premier ceramist in the Pacific Northwest. I sank into the chair beside my wheel, my legs suddenly unsteady. Yesterday, my sister had called my work pathetic. Today, her boss was offering me a partnership that would transform everything I'd been building. I need to ask, I said slowly. Does Natalie know about this? Marcus's expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. Natalie is a valuable member of our team, but she wasn't involved in developing this proposal. In fact, I'd prefer to keep the details confidential until we've finalized any agreement. There was something in his tone that suggested this wasn't just about business protocol. Something that made me wonder what conversations had been happening at Henley and Associates that I wasn't aware of. Can I have some time to think about it? Of course, this is a significant decision. Take whatever time you need. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. Here are the preliminary terms, the Thornfield contract details, and some projections about what this partnership could mean for your business. After he left, I sat in the quiet studio holding the folder like it might explode if handled incorrectly. Through the windows I could see people walking past on Hawthorne, going about their normal Tuesday afternoon routines. Unaware that my entire world had just shifted on its axis, I thought about calling Riley. About sharing this impossible development with the one person who would understand its significance. But first, I needed to process what had just happened. To understand how my supposedly pathetic hobby had become the centerpiece of a major business opportunity. The folder contained more than I'd expected. Medical projections that made my current income look like pocket change. A timeline for the Thornfield implementation that would require me to expand my studio and potentially hire additional marketing materials that positioned handmade ceramics as the future of authentic dining experiences. And buried in the details, a revelation that made everything else fall into perspective. The Thornfield Restaurant Group had been specifically seeking local artisans after a previous marketing campaign, one that relied heavily on mass-produced items imported from overseas, had generated negative publicity about their commitment to the community. Marcus hadn't just been following my work out of idle interest. He'd been building a solution to a client's problem, and my ceramics had become the answer. What Natalie saw as a pathetic hobby, her boss had recognized as exactly what his most important client needed. As the afternoon sun slanted through the studio windows, casting everything in golden light, I finally allowed myself to smile. Not the polite smile I'd worn through yesterday's conversation with Natalie, but something genuine and bright and full of possibilities I was just beginning to understand. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, decisions that would shape the future of everything I'd been building. But tonight, I was going to call Riley and tell her that sometimes, the people who think they understand success are the ones who understand it least of all. The coffee in my favorite handmade mug had gone cold while I stared at the partnership proposal spread across my kitchen table. 3 days had passed since Marcus Henley's visit, and I'd read through every page so many times that I could recite the profit projections from memory. The numbers were staggering, the opportunity unprecedented, but something held me back from calling him with my answer. Maybe it was the weight of transformation, the knowledge that accepting this partnership would fundamentally change everything I'd spent 7 years building. Or maybe it was the nagging voice in the back of my mind that sounded suspiciously like Natalie, questioning whether I deserved this kind of success, whether my work was truly worthy of such recognition. I'd been carrying my phone around like a talisman, Riley's number on speed dial, but each time I started to call her, I stopped. This decision felt too big to process through conversation, too personal to share until I understood what it meant for my future. The studio felt different when I unlocked it. That Thursday morning, the familiar space looked smaller somehow, as if Marcus's visit had revealed limitations I'd never noticed before. The single kiln that had seemed adequate for my needs now appeared constrained. The workspace that had felt cozy suddenly seemed cramped. I found myself mentally rearranging everything, imagining how it might expand to accommodate the scale of work the Thornfield contract would require. My first appointment was with Miss Chan, an elderly woman who commissioned a new mug every few months to replace ones that had been broken or chipped through daily use. She'd been one of my earliest customers, discovering my work at a holiday craft fair during my second year in business. Over time, our transactions had evolved into something deeper, a ritual of connection that meant as much to both of us as the ceramic pieces themselves. "You look distracted today, dear," she observed, watching me carefully wrap her latest purchase in tissue paper. The mug was glazed in deep blue with subtle copper accents, designed to complement the set I'd made for her over the years. "Just thinking about some changes that might be coming," I admitted, securing the wrapping with a hand-stamped sticker that bore my studio's logo. "Good changes? Or difficult ones?" Mrs. Chen had a way of asking direct questions that cut through pretense and demanded honest answers. It was a quality I'd come to appreciate during our monthly visits, even when it made me uncomfortable. Both, I think. Someone offered me an opportunity that could grow my business significantly, but it would mean changing how I work, taking on much larger projects. She nodded thoughtfully, running her fingers along the smooth surface of another mug on the display shelf. "You know, when my husband and I opened our restaurant 40 years ago, we faced a similar choice. We could stay small and comfortable, serving the same neighborhood customers we'd always known, or we could expand and risk losing what made us special in the first place. What did you choose?" "We expanded." Her eyes crinkled with memory. "And for a while it was terrifying. New responsibilities, bigger risks, the fear that we'd compromise the quality that had built our reputation. But you know what we discovered?" I shook my head, genuinely curious about her perspective. "Growth doesn't have to mean losing your essence. It can mean sharing what makes you special with more people. The question isn't whether you're ready for the opportunity. The question is whether the opportunity is worthy of what you've built." Her words stayed with me through the rest of the morning as I worked on a set of planters for a local garden center. The repetitive motion of throwing clay helped quiet my racing thoughts, allowing me to focus on the fundamental satisfaction of creating something beautiful and functional from raw earth. It was nearly noon when I heard the studio door chime. I looked up from the wheel expecting to see another customer, but instead found Natalie standing in the doorway. She looked different somehow, less polished than usual. Her hair was pulled back hastily, and there were tension lines around her eyes that I didn't remember seeing before. "I need to talk to you," she said without preamble. I cleaned my hands on my apron, noting the urgency in her voice. "Is everything okay? Can we sit down somewhere?" I gestured toward the small seating area I'd created near the front windows. Two mismatched chairs surrounding a low table I'd made during my 3rd year in the studio. The surface bore the scars of countless conversations, coffee rings and small scratches that told the story of its use. Natalie settled into one of the chairs, fidgeting with her purse strap in a way that reminded me of childhood, when she'd twist her hair while working through difficult homework problems. "Something happened at work yesterday," she began, not meeting my. "Marcus called me into his office for what I thought would be a routine project review. Instead, he started asking questions about you." A chill ran down my spine, though I tried to keep my expression neutral. "What kind of question?" "About your business, your capabilities, whether I thought you'd be interested in larger commercial projects." She paused, finally looking directly at me. "Zoe, he knows about our conversation on Tuesday, about what I said." The world seemed to tilt slightly, the way it sometimes did when I'd been working at the wheel for too long without a break. "He knows? I don't understand how, but he quoted me almost exactly. Called me into his office and asked if I really thought your work was pathetic. If I truly believed you needed to get a real job." My mind raced through possibilities. Marcus had mentioned wanting to keep the partnership proposal confidential until we'd finalized any agreement. Had someone overheard our conversation? Had he been planning to tell Natalie about his offer all along? "What did you tell him?" Natalie's composure cracked slightly, revealing something vulnerable underneath her professional facade. "I tried to explain that it was just sisterly concern, that I wanted you to have more security and stability, but he kept pushing, asking if I'd actually looked at your work, if I understood what you'd accomplished." She stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and staring out at the street. "Then he showed me something I'd never seen before, a folder full of articles about you, reviews of your work, photos of pieces you'd made for high-profile clients. There was so much. Zoe, how did I not know about any of this?" The question hung between us, loaded with implications that went far beyond simple oversight. How had my own sister remained unaware of the recognition my work had been receiving? How had she missed the growing respect I'd earned within Portland's arts community? "I tried to share those things with you," I said quietly. "The Portland Monthly article, the gallery shows, the commission for the mayor's office. But you were always busy, always had something more pressing to discuss." She turned back toward me, and for the first time in years, I saw genuine regret in her expression. I know I've been dismissive, and I know I hurt you with what I said on Tuesday, but Marcus made me realize something that I should have understood a long time ago." "What's that?" "I've been measuring your success by my standards, instead of recognizing that you've built something I could never create, something that matters to people in ways I don't fully understand." The admission caught me off guard. I'd expected defensiveness, maybe anger at being called out by her boss. I hadn't expected this level of introspection or acknowledgement. "There's more," she continued, returning to her chair. "Marcus told me about a major project the firm is working on, something involving local artisans. He wouldn't give me details, but he made it clear that your work is central to the proposal." I remained silent, unsure how much to reveal about my conversation with Marcus. The partnership offer felt too fragile to discuss, too uncertain to share even with family. "Zoe, I need you to know that whatever opportunity this represents, it has nothing to do with me." Marcus made that very clear. "This is about your talent, your reputation, the business you've built entirely on your own." She paused, struggling with words that seemed difficult to form. "I also need you to know that I'm sorry for Tuesday, for all the times I've minimized what you do, for not seeing what was right in front of me." An apology from Natalie was rare enough to feel momentous, but the timing complicated everything. Was she apologizing because she'd finally recognized the value of my work, or because her boss had made it clear that dismissing me could have professional consequences for her? "I appreciate that," I said carefully, "but I need to understand something. Are you sorry because you realize you were wrong, or because Marcus made you aware that being wrong could affect your position at the firm?" The bluntness of my question seemed to catch her off guard. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, clearly wrestling with the implications of her answer. "Both," she finally admitted. "I wish I could say it was purely about recognizing my mistakes, But Marcus's conversation definitely forced me to examine my assumptions more critically. At least she was being honest. It wasn't the pure contrition I might have hoped for, but it was more self-awareness than she'd shown in years. What did he say exactly? He asked if I thought it was appropriate for senior staff to publicly undermine local business owners, especially ones the firm might want to work with in the future. He pointed out that your reputation in the arts community could be valuable to our clients, and that my comments could be seen as unprofessional. The picture was becoming clearer. Marcus wasn't just interested in my ceramics, he was also managing the political dynamics within his own firm. My sister's dismissive attitude toward local artisans could become a liability if Henley and Associates wanted to position themselves as champions of the creative community. Then he showed me the financial records. Natalie continued. Revenue figures for your studio, growth patterns over the past 3 years, projections based on your current trajectory. Zoe, you're running a more successful business than I realized, more successful than some of the companies we represent. This revelation seemed to cost her something, an admission that challenged fundamental assumptions about our respective career choices. For years she'd seen my work as financially unsustainable, a creative indulgence that would eventually require rescue by more practical family members. I know you probably don't believe this, she said, but I am proud of what you've accomplished. I just didn't understand it before. I wanted to believe her, but trust was a fragile thing, easily broken and difficult to repair. Too many conversations had ended with her dismissing my choices. Too many family gatherings had featured subtle suggestions that I should consider more conventional career paths. I need time to process this, I said. The apology, the conversation with Marcus, all of it. She nodded, gathering her purse and standing to leave. I understand, but Zoe, whatever opportunity Marcus is offering you, don't let my previous comments influence your decision. You deserve whatever recognition comes your way. After she left, I sat in the quiet studio, trying to untangle the emotions her visit had stirred up. Relief at finally receiving acknowledgement of my work's value, frustration that it had taken her boss's intervention to prompt that recognition, uncertainty about whether her apology was genuine or strategic, but underneath all those complicated feelings was something simpler and more powerful: vindication. The work I'd been doing, the path I'd chosen, the sacrifices I'd made to build something meaningful, had been validated by someone whose opinion carried weight in Natalie's world. The afternoon brought a steady stream of customers, each interaction grounding me more firmly in the reality of what I'd built. A young couple selecting a wedding gift for friends, a businessman commissioning a set of coffee mugs for his office, a mother and daughter choosing a birthday present for a ceramics enthusiast. Each sale represented more than a financial transaction. It was evidence of connection, proof that my work resonated with people in ways that couldn't be measured by traditional business metrics. These customers weren't buying my pieces because they needed dishware. They were investing in the story, the craftsmanship, the human connection that came with handmade objects. As evening approached and the last customer departed, I finally called Riley. "You sound different," she observed after I'd finished recounting the day's events. "Less uncertain than you've been since Marcus made his offer." "I think I'm starting to understand something," I said, absently arranging tools on my workbench. For years I've been seeking validation from people who couldn't see the value in what I do, but the validation was always there, in the customers who return month after month, in the couples who trust me with their wedding celebrations, in the recognition from people who understand craftsmanship. And now I'm realizing that Natalie's opinion doesn't define the worth of my work, neither does Marcus's offer, for that matter. The partnership could be incredible, but my studio already has value. I've already built something successful. Riley was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear her smiling through the phone. That sounds like someone who's ready to make a decision. She was right. The partnership proposal no longer felt like a judgment of my worthiness, or a rescue from an unsuccessful venture. It felt like recognition of what I'd already accomplished, an opportunity to amplify work that was already meaningful. That evening I sat at my kitchen table with the partnership documents spread before me one final time. The financial projections were still impressive, the growth potential still exciting, but those weren't the factors that would determine my decision. Instead, I thought about Mrs. Chen's advice regarding growth that honored rather than compromised essential value. I considered the young couples who would celebrate anniversaries using dinnerware I'd created. I imagined the satisfaction of knowing that my work would become part of Portland's culinary landscape, connecting diners to the hands that had shaped their plates and bowls. The partnership wasn't just about business expansion, it was about sharing the philosophy that had driven my work from the beginning. The belief that handmade objects carried more than functional value, that they connected people to the artisans who created them, and to the communities that supported craft traditions. I picked up my phone and dialed Marcus's number. It was nearly 9 o'clock, later than I would normally call for business, but the decision felt urgent now that I'd finally reached it. "Zoe," he answered after the second ring, "I was hoping to hear from you." "I've made my decision about the partnership," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I'm interested, but I have some conditions I'd like to discuss." "I'm listening." "First, I want to maintain complete creative control over my work. The partnership can influence the scale and scope of projects, but not the artistic vision or the craftsmanship standards." "Absolutely, that's non-negotiable from our perspective as well." "Second, I want to ensure that any expansion preserves the handmade quality that defines my work. If we need to hire additional potters, they need to share the same commitment to traditional techniques and individual artistry." "Agreed. The authenticity is what makes your work valuable to our client." "And third," I paused, gathering courage for the request that mattered most, "I want a say in how the partnership is presented to your staff and to the public. This isn't about corporate acquisition of a small business, it's about collaboration between equals who share common value." Marcus was quiet for a moment, and I wondered if I'd overplayed my hand. When he finally spoke, there was warmth in his voice that suggested approval rather than concern. "Zoe, those conditions tell me exactly why this partnership is going to succeed. You understand that what you've built has value beyond its financial potential." "That's precisely what we need." We talked for another hour, working through details and timelines, discussing the balance between expansion and preservation that would define our collaboration. By the time I hung up, I felt energized in a way I hadn't experienced since my earliest days as a potter, when every piece that emerged successfully from the kiln felt like a small miracle. The next morning brought unseasonably warm weather, the kind of October day that reminded Portland residents why they'd chosen to live in the Pacific Northwest, despite the rain. I opened all the studio windows, letting fresh air circulate through the space as I began planning for the changes that partnership would bring. The Thornfield contract would require significant preparation. 6 restaurants, each needing complete table settings designed to complement their individual atmospheres, while maintaining a cohesive aesthetic that spoke to the restaurant group's commitment to local craftsmanship. It was the kind of challenge that would test every skill I'd developed over 7 years of professional ceramics work. But it was also exactly the kind of project I'd dreamed about during those early struggling years, when I'd wondered if choosing art over security had been naive. This wasn't just commercial work. It was an opportunity to demonstrate that handmade objects could compete with mass-produced alternatives on both quality and scale. I was sketching initial design concepts when the studio door chimed. Looking up, I expected to see a customer, but instead found a delivery person holding a large floral arrangement. "Zoe Brennan?" I nodded, accepting the delivery with confusion. The arrangement was stunning. A mix of seasonal flowers and earth tones that complemented the studio's aesthetic perfectly. The attached card was signed simply, "Congratulations on your partnership." "Welcome to the team, Mark." The gesture was thoughtful and professional, but it also felt like a public announcement. Anyone who saw the flowers would know that something significant had happened, that my business was entering a new phase. I was arranging the flowers on the front counter when the door chimed again. This time it was Cameron Wright, a local food blogger who'd written positively about my work in the past. She approached with the kind of purposeful energy that suggested professional rather than personal business. "I hope you don't mind the surprise visit," she said, pulling out a small recording device. "I heard through the grapevine that you're partnering with Henley and Associates on something big with the Thornfield Group. Any chance you'd be willing to share some details?" News traveled fast in Portland's interconnected creative community. I shouldn't have been surprised that word of the partnership was already circulating, but the speed caught me off guard. "I can confirm that there's a collaboration in development," I said carefully, "but I'd prefer to wait until everything is finalized before discussing specifics." Cameron nodded understandingly. "Fair enough, but can you talk about what this means for your studio? Will you be expanding? Hiring additional staff? Changing your approach to custom work?" These were exactly the questions I'd been wrestling with since accepting Marcus's offer. The partnership would undoubtedly change how I worked, but I was determined to ensure those changes enhanced rather than compromised what made my ceramics special. The core mission remains the same: creating handmade pieces that connect people to the artisans who make them, and to the communities that support craft traditions. The partnership just provides an opportunity to share that philosophy with a wider audience. We talked for 20 minutes, Cameron's questions helping me articulate thoughts that had been forming throughout the decision-making process. By the time she left, I felt more confident about my ability to navigate the public attention that would accompany the partnership announcement. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Regular customers stopping by for purchases, phone calls from other local artisans who'd heard rumors about the collaboration, emails from suppliers asking about potential increases in my materials order. The ceramics community was small enough that major changes for one studio affected the entire network, but the most significant moment came just before closing time, when Natalie appeared in the doorway again. This time she looked more like her usual professional self, but there was something different in her expression, something that might have been respect. "I heard about the partnership," she said simply. "Congratulations." "Thank you." She walked slowly through the studio, examining pieces she'd probably seen dozens of times before, but was perhaps truly noticing for the first time. When she reached the area where I displayed finished work, she stopped in front of a large serving bowl I'd completed the previous week. "Would you be willing to make something for me?" she asked. "For my apartment. Something that reminds me that beautiful things are worth investing in, even when they're not practical necessities." The request caught me completely off guard. In all our years of conflict over my career choice, Natalie had never expressed interest in owning my work. She'd complimented pieces when pressed, but always with the undertone of someone humoring a relative's hobby. "What did you have in mind?" "I trust your judgment," she said. "Something that fits your aesthetic. Something you'd be proud to have representing your work in my home." It was a small gesture, but it felt like the beginning of a different kind of relationship between us. Not the easy closeness we'd shared as children, before career choices and life philosophies had driven wedges between us, but something more honest and mutual than what we'd maintained as adults. After she left, I stood in the quiet studio as the evening light faded outside the window. The space looked the same as it had that morning, but everything felt different. The partnership with Marcus represented new possibilities for growth and recognition. Natalie's apology suggested the potential for repaired family relationships. The community's response indicated that my work had earned a level of respect I'd been too modest to fully acknowledge. But underneath all those external validations was something more fundamental: the satisfaction of knowing that I'd chosen correctly years ago, when I'd decided to pursue ceramics professionally. The path hadn't been easy, and there had been moments when doubt had nearly overwhelmed determination. But I'd persevered, and the work itself had proven worthy of that persistence. As I locked up the studio that evening, I thought about the young woman who'd first signed a lease on this space 7 years ago. She'd been full of dreams and fears in equal measure, uncertain whether her vision of creating meaningful handmade objects could sustain a life and a business. Tonight, I wished I could tell her that the fears had been largely unfounded, that the dreams had been, if anything, too small. The partnership would bring new challenges, greater responsibilities, and public scrutiny that would test every aspect of what I'd built. But it would also provide resources and opportunities that could amplify the impact of work I believed in deeply. Walking home through the familiar streets of Hawthorne, I felt the particular satisfaction that comes from making a decision that honors both ambition and values. Tomorrow would bring the first official planning meetings for the Thornfield project. Next week would likely include public announcements and media attention. The months ahead would require every skill I'd developed as both an artist and a business owner. But tonight, I was simply a potter who'd chosen to trust in the value of her work, and who'd been proven right in ways she'd never dared to imagine. The Portland Business Journal hit the newsstands on a drizzly Thursday morning, and by 10:30 my phone hadn't stopped ringing. The headline read, "Local ceramicist partners with marketing firm in major restaurant deal," accompanied by a photo of me at my pottery wheel that the photographer had taken 2 days earlier. The article was prominently placed on the front page of the business section, complete with quotes from Marcus about the importance of supporting local artisans and projections about the economic impact of the Thornfield collaboration. I'd known the announcement was coming, but seeing my name and photo in the city's primary business publication felt surreal. For 7 years, my work had been covered in arts magazines and lifestyle blogs, publications that celebrated creativity but didn't typically discuss profit margins or market expansion. This was different. This positioned my ceramic studio as a legitimate business story worthy of mainstream attention. The first call came from Dylan Park, who owned 3 restaurants in the Pearl District, and had purchased pieces from me in the past for his establishment. His voice carried an urgency that immediately put me on alert. "Zoe, I just read the journal article. We need to talk." "Good morning to you too, Dylan. What's on your mind?" "This Thornfield deal, what does it mean for your existing client? Are you still going to be available for custom work, or are you going corporate on us?" The question struck at the heart of my deepest concern about the partnership. Dylan represented exactly the kind of client relationship I'd spent years cultivating: local business owners who valued handmade pieces and understood the time and skill required to create them. Losing those connections in pursuit of larger contracts would be a betrayal of everything I'd built. "Nothing changes for existing clients," I assured him. "The partnership expands my capabilities, but it doesn't replace my commitment to the relationships I've already established." "You sure about that? Because I've seen what happens when small artisans get involved with corporate clients. The demands of scale can overwhelm everything else." His skepticism was understandable. Portland's creative community had witnessed several instances of successful local businesses being absorbed into larger operations, losing their distinctive character in the process. The fear that my partnership with Henley and Associates might follow a similar trajectory wasn't unreasonable. "Dylan, I chose this partnership specifically because it allows me to maintain creative control and continue working with clients like you. If anything changes about our relationship, it's that I'll have more resources to create exactly what you need." We talked for another 15 minutes, Dylan's concerns gradually shifting from suspicion to curiosity about how the expanded capabilities might benefit his restaurant. By the time we hung up, he'd scheduled a meeting to discuss a custom installation for his newest location. The pattern repeated throughout the morning: calls from existing clients, seeking reassurance, inquiries from potential new customers who'd read about the partnership, interview requests from local media outlets wanting to explore the story behind the business announcement. Each conversation required careful navigation between confidence and humility, ambition and authenticity. Around noon, the studio door chimed and Iris Valdez walked in, her expression unreadable. Iris was a fellow ceramicist who ran a smaller operation from her home studio, specializing in decorative pieces that sold primarily through craft fairs and online platforms. We'd maintained a friendly professional relationship over the years, supporting each other's work and occasionally collaborating on special projects. "Congratulations," she said, though her tone suggested the word carried complicated meanings. "Thank you. I hope this partnership creates opportunities for other local potters too." Iris picked up one of my mugs from the display shelf, turning it over to examine the maker's mark with more intensity than the piece warranted. "That's an optimistic perspective. Some of us are wondering if Henley and Associates is planning to corner the market on handmade ceramics for commercial clients." The accusation caught me off guard, though I recognized the underlying fear. Portland's creative economy depended on diversity, multiple artisans serving different market segments and maintaining the ecosystem that made the city attractive to both residents and tourists. If my partnership monopolized commercial opportunities, it could damage that balance. "Iris, you know that's not how I operate. I've always supported other potters, referred clients when projects weren't right for my studio, promoted community events that benefit all of us." "I know that's how you've operated in the past," she said, setting the mug down carefully. "But partnerships change people. Suddenly you're part of a larger organization with different priorities, different pressures. She moved toward the window, looking out at the street where a food cart was setting up for the lunch rush. The article mentioned that Henley and Associates is looking to establish relationships with other local artisans. What does that mean? Exactly. I realized I didn't have a complete answer to her question. Marcus and I had discussed the partnership's potential to connect other makers with commercial opportunities, but we hadn't developed specific mechanisms for how that would work. I think it means creating a network where different artisans can contribute their specialties to larger projects. Like if a restaurant wants handmade ceramics, custom metalwork, and artisan textiles, we could coordinate those elements instead of clients having to manage multiple vendor relationships. Iris nodded slowly, considering the implications. That could be beneficial if it's handled thoughtfully, but it could also create a hierarchy where you become the gatekeeper for opportunities that used to be available to all of us independently. Her concern was valid, and it highlighted responsibilities I hadn't fully considered. The partnership didn't just affect my business. It could reshape how Portland's entire artisan community interacted with commercial clients. Would you be interested in being part of those conversations? I asked. When Marcus and I sit down to plan how this network might function, I'd value your input about protecting the independence and diversity that makes our community strong. For the first time since she'd entered, Iris smiled genuinely. I'd appreciate that. I think most of us. We're not opposed to your success, Zoe. We just want to make sure it doesn't come at the expense of opportunities for everyone else. After she left, I spent the afternoon fielding more calls and emails, each interaction adding layers to my understanding of how public the partnership had become. The announcement had rippled through multiple communities, the business world that saw it as an interesting model for corporate artisan collaboration, the culinary industry that was curious about its implications for restaurant design, the arts community that was watching to see whether it represented authentic support for local makers or corporate appropriation of creative work. The most challenging conversation came from a reporter at Willamette Week, Portland's alternative weekly newspaper known for its skeptical approach to business stories that claimed social benefits. Brennan. Critics might argue that this partnership represents the gentrification of Portland's art scene, where corporate interests co-opt local culture for profit. How do you respond to that? The question was loaded with implications I hadn't considered from that angle. Portland's relationship with gentrification was complicated and contentious, with longtime residents expressing concern about development that displaced existing communities while claiming to celebrate local character. I understand that concern, I said carefully, but I think there's a difference between co-optation and collaboration. This partnership maintains my creative independence while providing resources to expand work that was already happening. It's not about changing what I do to suit corporate needs. It's about corporate recognition of the value that already exists in what I do. But doesn't the scale of the Thornfield contract necessarily change the nature of your work? Moving from individual pieces to mass production, each piece will still be individually thrown and glazed by hand. The scale increases, but the fundamental process remains artisanal. We're not talking about factory production with my signature attached. We're talking about expanding the capacity for genuine handmade work. The reporter pressed for another 20 minutes, exploring every angle where the partnership might be vulnerable to criticism. By the time the conversation ended, I felt mentally exhausted but also more articulate about defending choices I believed in. Evening brought a different kind of challenge when I arrived home to find Natalie waiting outside my apartment building. She leaned against her car with the posture of someone who'd been rehearsing a conversation, and her expression suggested this wasn't a casual visit. I wanted to congratulate you properly, she said as I approached, away from the studio, where we could talk without interruption. Thank you, though you could have called first. I could have, but some conversations are better in person. She gestured toward the small park across the street. Walk with me? We crossed to the park where late autumn had stripped most leaves from the trees, leaving branches that looked like delicate sculptures against the darkening sky. The air carried hints of wood smoke from nearby fireplaces, and the dampness that was Portland's autumn signature. I owe you more than an apology, Natalie began as we followed a path that wound between empty playground equipment. I owe you an acknowledgement that I've been wrong about your work for years, and that my being wrong has probably caused you real harm. Her directness surprised me. Throughout our relationship, Natalie had rarely admitted error without qualification or excuse. What kind of harm? Doubt, for one thing. Every time I questioned your choices or suggested you needed a more conventional career, I was undermining confidence you should have had in your own abilities and vision. She stopped walking, turning to face me in the gathering dusk. But there's something else. Something I need to tell you about what's been happening at work. A chill that had nothing to do with the October air ran down my spine. What do you mean? Marcus has been asking questions about my attitude toward local artisans, about whether I understand the value they bring to our client relationships. He's made it clear that my dismissive comments about your work reflect poorly on my judgment and my suitability for client-facing roles. The implications were starting to become clear. Are you saying your job is at risk because of what you said about my ceramics? I'm saying that my credibility at the firm has been damaged because I failed to recognize the commercial potential of something that was right in front of. Marcus sees that as a fundamental failure of market analysis. We resumed walking, our footsteps loud on the damp pathway. He's right, she continued. I should have been encouraging the firm to develop relationships with local makers years ago, especially ones with established reputations and growing businesses. Instead, I was so focused on traditional marketing approaches that I missed opportunities that were obvious to someone willing to look. The conversation was taking a direction I hadn't anticipated. What had started as a family reconciliation was revealing professional consequences I hadn't considered. Natalie, I never intended for my success to create problems for your career. I know, but my problems aren't your responsibility to solve. They're the result of my own blind spots and assumptions. She paused at a bench beneath a streetlight that had just flickered on. Can we sit for a minute? The bench was damp from earlier rain, but we sat anyway, the cold seeping through our jackets as we watched a jogger pass under the next streetlight. There's something else, Natalie said. Something that might help you understand why I've been so resistant to acknowledging your success. I waited, sensing that whatever came next would be important. When we were kids, you were always the creative one, the one who could make beautiful things, who saw possibilities in materials that looked like trash to everyone else. I was the practical one, the one who followed rules and achieved conventional success. She stared straight ahead, not meeting my eyes. I think I convinced myself that creativity wasn't valuable because it was the one area where you were clearly more talented than me. If I could dismiss your artistic abilities as impractical or unmarketable, then my conventional achievements seemed more impressive by comparison. The admission hung between us like visible breath in the cold air. It explained years of subtle competition I'd felt but never fully understood, the way my artistic pursuits seemed to threaten rather than complement her corporate accomplishments. I've been jealous, she said simply. Jealous that you found something you loved and built a life around it while I've been climbing a ladder toward goals that feel increasingly hollow. Natalie, I'm not looking for sympathy, she said quickly. I'm just trying to explain why I've been so wrong about your work and why this partnership announcement has forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about my own choices. We sat in silence for several minutes, processing the weight of what she'd shared. The park around us was quiet except for the distant sound of traffic on Hawthorne and the occasional rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. What happens now? I asked finally. Now I figure out how to rebuild my credibility at work and you continue building something that's clearly much more significant than I ever understood. She stood up, brushing dampness from her jacket. And maybe we find a way to have a relationship that isn't built on competition or comparison. Walking back toward my apartment, I felt the complexity of family dynamics shifting around us. The partnership announcement hadn't just changed my professional circumstances. It had forced both of us to examine assumptions and resentments that had shaped our relationship for years. The next morning brought fresh challenges when I arrived at the studio to find a small crowd gathered outside. At first I thought something had happened to the building, but as I got closer I realized the people were customers and curiosity seekers drawn by the newspaper cover. "Are you the Potter from the article?" asked a woman holding a copy of the business journal. "I am. Can I help you with something?" I'd like to commission a set of dishes for my daughter's wedding, something that shows she's supporting local art. For the next 2 hours, I fielded a steady stream of inquiries from people who'd never visited the studio before but were interested in owning pieces created by someone they'd read about in the business section. The attention was flattering but also overwhelming, forcing me to confront the reality that public recognition came with its own set of pressures and expectations. Around 10 o'clock, Marcus arrived for our scheduled planning meeting, carrying architectural plans for the Thornfield restaurants and a folder thick with specifications and timelines. "Popular place this morning," he observed, noting the continued stream of visitors. "The article generated more interest than I expected." "That's excellent. Media attention translates to brand recognition, which benefits both your studio and our partnership." We spread the restaurant plans across my work table, Marcus explaining the design aesthetic for each location and how custom ceramics would integrate with the overall atmosphere. The scope was even larger than I'd initially understood, encompassing not just table settings but architectural elements like tile work and decorative installations. "This is going to require significant expansion of your production capacity," Marcus said, pointing to timelines that showed delivery dates only 4 months away. "Have you given thought to how you want to handle the additional workload?" The question I'd been dreading had arrived. The Thornfield contract was too large for me to complete alone within the required time frame, but adding staff to my studio felt like crossing a line between artisan workshop and commercial operation. "I've been considering bringing in other local potters as collaborators rather than employees," I said. "People like Iris Valdez who have complementary skills and could maintain the handmade quality while sharing the workload." Marcus nodded approvingly. "That approach aligns perfectly with our positioning around supporting the local arts community. Instead of one potter scaling up to industrial levels, we're creating opportunities for multiple artisans to contribute their expertise." We spent the next hour sketching out a collaborative model that would involve 4 additional ceramicists, each responsible for specific elements of the overall project while maintaining the aesthetic coherence that the restaurants require. It was an ambitious structure that would test my ability to coordinate creative work across multiple studios, while ensuring quality standards. "There's one more thing we need to discuss," Marcus said as we were wrapping up. "The project's success will likely generate additional opportunities with other restaurant groups and commercial clients. Are you prepared for that level of growth?" The question touched on fears I'd been carrying since accepting the partnership. Growth could mean validation and financial security, but it could also mean losing the intimate connection with individual pieces that had drawn me to ceramics in the first place. "I think the key is maintaining the values that make the work meaningful, while adapting the scale to meet new opportunities," I said. "As long as every piece still bears the mark of human hands and individual attention, expansion doesn't have to compromise authenticity." Marcus smiled with what looked like genuine respect. "That philosophy is exactly why this partnership is going to succeed. You understand that growth doesn't require abandoning the principles that created value in the first place." After he left, I stood in the studio surrounded by the plans and specifications that would define the next phase of my career. The space that had felt too small just days ago now seemed like the seed of something much larger and more complex. The afternoon brought a visit from Cameron Wright, the food blogger who'd interviewed me earlier in the week. This time she was accompanied by a photographer who spent an hour capturing images of me working at the wheel, surrounded by pieces in various stages of completion. "The story's generating a lot of reader interest," Cameron said as the photographer packed up his equipment. "People are curious about whether this represents a new model for how restaurants can support local artisans." "What kind of response are you getting?" "Mostly positive, but there are some concerns about whether partnerships like this might price out smaller restaurants that can't afford custom pieces. There's also debate about whether handmade items can realistically meet the durability requirements of commercial food service." Both concerns were valid and highlighted challenges I'd need to address as the project moved forward. Commercial ceramics face different demands than residential pieces, requiring glazes that could withstand industrial dishwashing and designs that could survive the rigors of professional kitchen environments. "Those are exactly the kinds of problems that make this project interesting," I said. "Figuring out how to create pieces that maintain artistic integrity while meeting practical requirements." As evening approached and the studio finally emptied of visitors, I found myself alone with the weight of everything that had changed in just a few days. The partnership announcement had transformed my quiet ceramics studio into a focal point for conversations about art, commerce, community development, and the future of Portland's creative economy. Standing at my pottery wheel, I placed my hands on a fresh mound of clay and began the centering process that always grounded me when everything else felt chaotic. The familiar resistance of the earth against my palms, the gradual yielding as pressure and patience combined to create symmetry, reminded me why I'd chosen this work in the first place. The clay didn't care about business partnerships or media attention. It responded only to skill, intention, and the human touch that guided its transformation from formless mass to functional vessel. Whatever challenges the coming months would bring, this fundamental relationship between maker and material would remain constant. As the piece took shape beneath my hands, I thought about all the conversations of the past few days. The fears and hopes and expectations that different people had projected onto my partnership announcement. Some saw it as validation of local arts, others as potential threat to community value. Some viewed it as smart business strategy, others as sellout to corporate interests. But sitting at my wheel in the quiet studio, I understood that the partnership's ultimate success wouldn't be measured by any of those external assessments. It would be determined by whether the pieces I created continued to carry the intention and care that made them worth owning, whether they still told the story of human hands shaping earth into objects that could hold memory and meaning along with food and drink. The bowl emerging from the clay was simple and elegant, its walls rising in a gentle curve that would make it equally suitable for holding soup or displaying fruit. As I shaped the rim with careful pressure, I imagined it in one of the Thornfield restaurants, cradling someone's lunch while they talked with friends, or conducted business or simply took a moment of quiet in their busy day. That connection between maker and user, that invisible thread that linked my hands to every future meal served in the vessel I was creating, remained unchanged regardless of how many people might see my name in newspaper headlines. The partnership would expand the reach of that connection, but it wouldn't alter its essential nature. By the time I finished the piece and set it aside to dry, the studio was dark except for the work lights above my wheel. Outside, Hawthorne Street had settled into its evening rhythm, restaurants filling with dinner crowds, bars welcoming happy-hour patrons, shops preparing to close for the night. Tomorrow would bring new conversations about the partnership, more planning meetings with Marcus, continued negotiations with potential collaborating potters. The Thornfield project would move forward with all its challenges and opportunities. But tonight I was simply a ceramicist who'd shaped one more piece of clay into something useful and beautiful, continuing a practice that connected me to thousands of years of human creativity and craft tradition. The partnership would change many things about how I worked, but it wouldn't change the fundamental satisfaction of that ancient alchemy that transformed earth and fire into vessels for daily life. 3 weeks into November, everything changed in a single morning. I was loading the first batch of Thornfield pieces into the kiln when my phone rang with a call that would reshape not just the partnership, but everything I thought I knew about corporate loyalty and family dynamics. "Zoe, we have a problem." Marcus's voice carried a tension I'd never heard before, sharp and urgent in a way that immediately put me on high alert. "What kind of problem? I need you to come to the office immediately. There's been a development with the Thornfield project that we need to address in person." The drive to Henley and Associates took me through downtown Portland's morning rush, past food trucks setting up for the lunch crowd and office workers clutching coffee cups like lifeline. The building that housed the marketing firm was one of those renovated brick structures that Portland specialized in, former industrial space converted to house the creative professionals who'd made the city their home. Marcus met me in the lobby, his usual composed demeanor replaced by something that looked dangerously close to panic. "Conference room 3, he said without preamble, leading me toward an elevator that smelled of expensive cologne and anxiety. The conference room overlooked the Willamette River, its windows providing a view that probably cost the firm thousands in monthly rent. But I barely noticed the scenery because my attention was immediately captured by the woman sitting at the head of the polished table, a stack of documents spread before her like evidence in a trial. "Zoe Brennan, meet Victoria Thornfield," Marcus said, his voice carrying undertones I couldn't quite decipher. Victoria Thornfield was not what I'd expected from the owner of Portland's most successful restaurant group. Instead of the middle-aged businessman I'd pictured, She was a woman in her early 50s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of my appearance in the span of a handshake. "Brennan, I've been looking forward to this meeting," she said, though her tone suggested the anticipation hadn't been entirely pleasant. "Likewise, I'm excited about the opportunity to create pieces for your restaurants. That's actually what we need to discuss." She gestured toward one of the chairs arranged around the table. "Please, sit down." The formality of the setup was starting to make me nervous. This felt less like a planning meeting and more like an interrogation, though I couldn't imagine what I might be accused of. Victoria opened one of the folders in front of her, revealing what looked like a detailed financial report. "Ms. Brennan, how familiar are you with the economic realities of running a restaurant group in today's market?" The question seemed oddly theoretical for someone who was supposed to be commissioning custom ceramics. "I understand it's challenging, with thin profit margins and high overhead costs." "Exactly. Which is why every expenditure has to be justified not just in terms of aesthetic value but in terms of practical return on investment." She flipped through several pages of the report. "Your proposed pricing for the custom pieces represents a significant portion of our annual procurement budget." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair beside me. "Victoria, we've discussed the pricing extensively. The value proposition is clear when you consider the marketing benefits of supporting local artisans." "Marketing benefits are theoretical," Victoria replied, her voice taking on an "What's concrete is that I can source comparable ceramic pieces from overseas suppliers at roughly 30% of your quoted prices." The statement hit me like cold water. After weeks of planning and preparation, after bringing in collaborating potters and expanding my studio's capacity, the client was questioning whether handmade ceramics were worth their cost. "Ms. Thornfield," I said carefully, "the pieces we're creating aren't comparable to mass-produced import. Each one is individually crafted, with variations that tell the story of human hands in the making process." "Human hands are expensive," she said bluntly. "My customers care about the quality of their food and the atmosphere of the restaurant. They don't inspect the bottom of their plates to check for maker's marks." The conversation was spiraling in a direction I hadn't anticipated. Everything about the Thornfield project had been predicated on the idea that the restaurant group valued authentic, locally made pieces enough to pay premium prices for them. "Victoria," Marcus interjected, "this partnership was designed around your expressed interest in supporting Portland's creative community. The custom ceramics are part of a larger brand story about local authenticity." "Brand stories don't pay rent," Victoria said, closing the folder with a sharp snap. "I've been reviewing the numbers and I'm having serious doubts about whether this level of investment in custom pieces makes financial sense." The room fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic from the street below. I felt like I was watching the collapse of everything I'd been building toward over the past month, but there was something about Victoria's presentation that didn't feel entirely genuine. "May I ask what changed?" I said. "When Marcus first approached you about this project, my understanding was that you were enthusiastic about featuring local artisans." Victoria's expression shifted slightly, revealing something that might have been calculation rather than genuine concern about cost. "Let's just say that some information has come to light about the true market value of handmade ceramics in commercial settings." Marcus leaned forward, his voice taking on a defensive tone. "What information? Who have you been talking to?" "I prefer not to reveal my sources, but I've been advised that restaurants in other cities have found comparable results using less expensive alternatives to custom pottery." There was something about the way she said "advised" that made my instincts prickle. This felt less like an independent business decision, and more like the result of outside influence. "Ms. Thornfield, can you tell me specifically what concerns you have about the pieces we've proposed? Are there quality issues, timeline problems, something concrete we can address?" She shuffled through her papers, pulling out what looked like a printout from a website. "I've been shown examples of ceramic lines that are produced overseas but designed to look handmade. The aesthetic differences are minimal, but the cost savings are substantial." Marcus's face had gone pale during this exchange, and I was beginning to understand why. The Thornfield project wasn't just my largest commission. It was also central to Henley and Associates' expansion into artisan partnerships. If it collapsed, it would take the entire strategy with it. "Victoria, We've been working on this project for months, Marcus said. The marketing campaign, the media coverage, the positioning around supporting local makers, all of that has been built around authentic partnerships with Portland artisans. Marketing campaigns can be adjusted, she replied coolly. What can't be adjusted are budget realities in an increasingly competitive restaurant market. I found myself in the strange position of watching two people discuss my work as if I wasn't in the room, reducing months of creative planning to line items in a budget spreadsheet. But there was still something about Victoria's arguments that felt scripted, as if she was performing reluctance rather than genuinely experiencing it. Miss Thornfield, could I ask you to be more specific about these alternative sources you've been shown? It might help me understand how to address your concerns. She hesitated for just a moment, the first crack in her composed presentation. I'd rather not get into proprietary details about supplier relationships. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Someone else was driving this conversation, someone who had provided Victoria with ammunition to use against the artisan partnership but who remained unnamed and invisible. I understand your concern about costs, I said, but I think there's value in the local partnership that goes beyond the immediate expense. When your customers know that their meals are being served on pieces created by Portland artisans, it creates a connection to the community that can't be replicated by overseas manufacturing. That's a nice sentiment, Victoria said, but sentiment doesn't appear on profit and loss statement. Marcus tried a different approach. What if we restructured the pricing, found ways to reduce costs while maintaining the local artisan component? How much reduction are we talking about? Victoria asked, though her tone suggested this wasn't a genuine negotiation. We could explore volume discounts, simplified designs, perhaps a hybrid approach where some pieces are fully custom while others are more standardized, Marcus offered. I watched this exchange with growing frustration. Everything about the project that had excited me, the creativity and individuality that made handmade ceramics special, was being negotiated away, in pursuit of a client who seemed determined to find reasons for rejection. I appreciate the flexibility, Victoria said, but I think I need more time to consider whether any version of this partnership makes sense for my business. That was when I realized what was actually happening. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a dismissal disguised as budget analysis. Victoria Thornfield had already decided to abandon the project, but she was using cost concerns to provide cover for a decision that had been made for different reasons. Miss Thornfield, I said, standing up from my chair, I think we should be honest about what's happening here. Someone has convinced you that working with local artisans is a mistake, and you're using budget concerns to justify a decision that's already been made. Her composed facade cracked slightly, revealing something that looked like surprise at being called out so direct. I don't know what you're implying, but my concerns about costs are entirely legitimate. I'm sure they are, I said, but they're not the real issue. The real issue is that someone has told you that supporting local makers is bad business. Probably someone who profits from the cheaper alternatives you've been shown. Marcus was staring at me with a mixture of admiration and horror, clearly torn between supporting my confrontation and trying to salvage a relationship that might still be repairable. Brennan, I think you're overstepping, Victoria said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier authority. Maybe I am, but I'd rather overstep than pretend this is about anything other than someone trying to undermine partnerships that threaten their interest. The room fell silent again, tension crackling between us like the static electricity that sometimes built up around my kiln during firing. Victoria gathered her papers with deliberate precision, clearly preparing to end the meeting. I think we need to table this discussion while I continue reviewing the financial implications, she said. Marcus, I'll be in touch about next steps. She left the conference room with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to controlling conversations, leaving Marcus and me staring at each other across the polished table. Well, Marcus said, after a long moment, that went about as badly as it could have. What aren't you telling me? I asked. That whole performance felt rehearsed, like she came in here with a predetermined outcome. Marcus walked to the window, staring out at the river where cargo ships moved slowly between the bridges. There are things happening in this industry that are bigger than our partnership, bigger than any individual project. What kind of things? He turned back toward me, his expression serious in a way I'd rarely seen. Portland's restaurant scene has been getting attention from national chains and investment groups. There's money flowing in from outside the city, money that sees local partnerships as inefficient and unprofitable. The implications were starting to become clear. Are you saying someone is actively working against local artisan relationships? I'm saying that the economics of restaurant operation are changing, and not everyone benefits when local businesses support each other instead of seeking the cheapest possible supply. We talked for another hour, Marcus explaining the complex web of suppliers, distributors, and investors that shaped Portland's food industry. The picture that emerged was of a community under pressure from forces that valued efficiency over authenticity, profit margins over relationship. The Thornfield project, which had seemed like a straightforward commission just hours earlier, was apparently part of a larger battle over the future of Portland's creative economy. Victoria's objections to pricing weren't just about budget constraints, they reflected a philosophical divide about whether local partnerships were worth preserving in a marketplace that rewarded lowest-cost solutions. By the time I left the Henley & Associates building, I felt like I was carrying the weight of much more than a single failed project. The partnership with Marcus had opened a window into economic realities I'd been shielded from as an independent artist. The forces that threatened my ceramic studio were the same ones that challenged every local business trying to maintain authentic relationships in an increasingly globalized marketplace. The drive back to Hawthorne took me past restaurants and shops that formed the ecosystem I'd been part of for 7 years. Dillon Park's establishments, where my pieces had found homes, the gallery where Riley showcased local artists, the coffee roasters and breweries and bookstores that made Portland feel like a community rather than just a city. All of it was apparently under threat from interests that saw local partnerships as obstacles to profit rather than sources of value. When I reached the studio, I found Iris Valdez waiting outside, her expression suggesting she'd heard about the morning's developments. Cameron Wright called me, she said without preamble. She heard through restaurant industry contacts that the Thornfield deal might be falling apart. Portland's creative community was small enough that news traveled fast, especially news that affected multiple artisans who'd been planning to participate in the collaborative project. It's not falling apart, I said, unlocking the studio. It's being undermined by people who profit from keeping local businesses separated from each other. Inside, the studio felt different than it had that morning. The pieces waiting for their final firing, the expanded workspace I'd created to accommodate the Thornfield production, the plans and sketches that had consumed weeks of preparation, all of it now felt precarious in a way that had nothing to do with artistic vision or business planning. What does this mean for the rest of us? Iris asked, examining one of the test pieces I'd created for the restaurant project. If the partnership model doesn't work for a project this size, what happens to smaller collaboration? It was a question I couldn't answer because I was still processing the implications myself. The Thornfield project had been conceived as proof that local artisans could meet commercial demands while maintaining the quality and authenticity that made their work valuable. If it failed, it would send a message that handmade pieces were impractical luxuries rather than viable alternatives to mass production. I don't think the model failed, I said slowly. I think it was sabotaged by interests that don't want it to succeed. Iris sat down heavily in one of the chairs near the front window, her usual energy replaced by something that looked like defeat. Same result either way. The other potters I was talking to about joining the project, they're all going to hear that it collapsed and assume that collaborative partnerships are too risky. She was right. The failure of a high-profile project would have ripple effects throughout Portland's artisan community, reinforcing skepticism about whether makers could successfully work together on commercial ventures. That afternoon brought a call from Riley, who'd heard about the morning's meeting through the network of gallery owners and arts advocates who tracked developments in Portland's creative economy. This isn't just about your project, she said, her voice carrying the kind of urgency that suggested she'd been making similar calls all day. There's a pattern emerging of local partnerships being undermined just as they're about to succeed. What kind of pattern? 3 other collaborations between restaurants and local makers have fallen apart in the past 2 months, all at the last minute, all citing budget concerns that weren't issues during initial planning. The information hit me like a physical blow. If Riley was right, then the Thornfield situation wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a coordinated effort to prevent local businesses from supporting each other. Who's behind it? That's what we're trying to figure out. But there are rumors about a consulting firm that's been advising restaurant owners about supply chain optimization, showing them how to cut costs by abandoning local supply. I thought about Victoria Thornfield's presentation, the way she'd referenced information from unnamed sources, the scripted quality of her objections to the ceramic pricing. Riley, I think I might have met with one of their targets today. Everything about that meeting felt like Victoria was reading from someone else's playbook. We talked for another half hour comparing notes about what we'd each observed and heard. By the time we hung up, the scope of what we were dealing with had become clear. This wasn't about individual business decisions or market forces. It was about a deliberate campaign to break down the relationships that made Portland's creative economy distinctive. That evening, I sat in my apartment with a bottle of wine and a legal pad, trying to organize everything I'd learned into something coherent. The Thornfield project hadn't failed because of cost concerns or timeline issues. It had been targeted because it represented exactly the kind of local partnership that threatened interests invested in maintaining separation between producers and suppliers. The question now was whether to fight back or retreat to the safety of smaller, less visible projects that wouldn't attract the attention of forces working against local collaboration. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang with a call from Mark. "I've been making calls all afternoon," he said without preamble. "Trying to understand what happened in that meeting and whether there's any way to salvage the project." "What did you find out?" "Victoria Thornfield has been working with a consulting firm called Strategic Supply Solutions. They specialize in helping restaurants reduce costs by switching to more efficient supply chains." The name meant nothing to me, but the function was becoming clear. And more efficient means eliminating local suppliers. Among other things, they've developed a comprehensive approach to restaurant profitability that treats local partnerships as unnecessary expenses, rather than valuable relationships. Marcus paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. But here's the interesting part. Strategic Supply Solutions is owned by a consortium of overseas manufacturers and import companies. They profit directly when restaurants abandon local suppliers in favor of cheaper alternatives. The conflict of interest was obvious once he pointed it out. A consulting firm that claimed to provide objective advice about supply chain efficiency was actually working for companies that benefited when restaurants chose imported goods over locally made alternatives. So Victoria wasn't making an independent business decision. I don't think she realized she wasn't. The presentation she received probably looked like neutral financial analysis, but it was designed to reach a predetermined conclusion. We talked through strategies for exposing the manipulation, ways to present Victoria with information that might counter what she'd been told by Strategic Supply Solutions. But as the conversation continued, I realized that fighting for the Thornfield project might be less important than addressing the larger threat to Portland's creative community. "Marcus, what if we're approaching this wrong? What if instead of trying to save one project, we focus on protecting the entire ecosystem that makes these partnerships possible?" "What do you mean?" "I mean going public with what we've discovered, showing restaurant owners and local makers that they're being manipulated by interests that profit from keeping them separated." It was a risky strategy that would turn a business dispute into a public battle over the future of Portland's economy. But it might also be the only way to prevent other local partnerships from being undermined by the same tactics that had targeted the Thornfield project. "That's a declaration of war," Marcus said quietly. "Maybe it's a war that needs to be fought." After we hung up, I spent the rest of the evening researching Strategic Supply Solutions, following the digital trails that connected the consulting firm to overseas manufacturers and import operations. The picture that emerged was of a sophisticated operation designed to systematically break down local business relationships under the guise of improving efficiency and profitability. By midnight, I'd filled several pages with notes and connections, evidence of a pattern that went far beyond individual business decisions. Portland's creative community was under attack by forces that saw local partnerships as obstacles to profit rather than sources of value and authenticity. The question now was whether anyone would care enough to fight back, or whether the convenience of cheaper alternatives would prove more powerful than the connections that had made Portland special. Sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by research notes and empty wine glasses, I made a decision that would define not just my business future but my role in a community I'd been part of for 7 years. Tomorrow I would start making calls to every restaurant owner, gallery director, and local business advocate I knew. If Strategic Supply Solutions wanted a war over the future of Portland's creative economy, they were about to discover that local artisans had more fight in them than anyone expected. The call that changed everything came at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after I'd decided to wage war against Strategic Supply Solutions. I was preparing clay for the day's work when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize, though the area code was local. Ms. Brennan, this is Janet Morrison from KOIN News. I received some very interesting documents yesterday that I think you'll want to see. My hands stilled on the clay, that familiar sensation of the world shifting beneath my feet. What kind of document? Internal communications from Strategic Supply Solutions, including emails that specifically mention targeting your partnership with Henley and Associates as a way to discourage other local collaborations. Can you meet me this morning? The coffee shop Janet suggested was one of those carefully curated Portland establishments that served single-origin beans and displayed local artwork on walls painted in muted earth tones. She was already waiting when I arrived, a woman in her 40s with the kind of sharp intelligence that made successful investigative reporters. Someone wanted these documents to see daylight, she said without preamble, sliding a thick manila envelope across the small wooden table. They were delivered to the station yesterday with a note saying that Portland's creative community deserved to know what was being done to them. Inside the envelope were printouts of email exchanges, strategic planning documents, and financial records that painted a comprehensive picture of Strategic Supply Solutions' campaign against local business partnerships. The evidence was damning and detailed, revealing not just the manipulation of individual clients like Victoria Thornfield, but a systematic effort to undermine Portland's entire creative economy. One email chain particularly caught my attention, between Strategic Supply Solutions executives discussing the Thornfield project specifically. The ceramic partnership is getting significant media attention, wrote someone identified as Regional Director James Wall. If it succeeds, it could establish a template for other restaurants to follow. We need to ensure it fails in a way that discourages similar ventures. Another executive had responded with tactical suggestions, recommend focusing on cost analysis that doesn't account for marketing value or customer loyalty benefits. Most clients will prioritize immediate savings over long-term relationship build. The correspondence continued for pages, revealing a sophisticated understanding of how to present arguments that would sound reasonable to business owners, while serving Strategic Supply Solutions' agenda of promoting imported alternatives over local partnerships. This is explosive, I said, looking up from the documents. Janet nodded, her expression serious. It's evidence of systematic market manipulation designed to benefit overseas suppliers at the expense of local businesses. The question is whether you're willing to go on record about what happened to your project. The decision should have been difficult, but it wasn't. Everything I'd witnessed during the meeting with Victoria Thornfield, all the manipulated arguments and scripted objections, made perfect sense in light of these internal communications. I'm willing, but I want this story to be about more than just my experience. This affects every local maker in Portland. Janet smiled with the satisfaction of a reporter who'd found a source willing to tell the complete story. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. We spent the next 2 hours going through my experience with the Thornfield project, from the initial excitement of the partnership announcement, through the devastating meeting where Victoria had presented her cost concern. Janet asked detailed questions that helped me understand how my specific situation fit into the larger pattern of manipulation revealed by the documents. One more thing, Janet said as we were wrapping up. Do you know who might have leaked these documents? Someone with access to Strategic Supply Solutions' internal communications. I shook my head, though a suspicion was forming. The leak had come at exactly the right moment, just as I was preparing to fight back against the forces that had undermined the Thornfield project. The timing suggested someone who knew about my situation and wanted to provide ammunition for the battle. The story aired that evening during the 6 o'clock news, leading with footage of me at my pottery wheel while Janet's voiceover explained how overseas interests were systematically targeting Portland's creative partnership. The internal documents were presented as evidence of what she called economic warfare against local business relationships. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My phone started ringing before the story had finished airing. Calls from restaurant owners who'd been approached by Strategic Supply Solutions, local makers who'd experienced similar mysterious project cancellations, and business advocates who'd suspected something like this was happening but hadn't been able to prove. The most significant call came from Victoria Thornfield herself, her voice tight with what sounded like barely controlled anger. "Miss Brennan, I just watched the news story. I need to see you immediately." We met at her flagship restaurant in the Pearl District, a space that embodied everything Portland's food scene aspired to be: locally sourced ingredients, thoughtful design, an atmosphere that felt both sophisticated and welcoming. Victoria was waiting at a corner table, the Strategic Supply Solutions folder I remembered from our previous meeting, sitting closed beside her water glass. "I owe you an apology," she said before I'd even settled into my chair, and an explanation. Her composure was different than it had been during the meeting at Marcus's office. The confident authority had been replaced by something that looked like embarrassment and determination in equal measure. When James Walsh first approached me about supply chain optimization, everything he said made sense from a business perspective: lower costs, improved efficiency, standardized quality control. He presented local partnerships as well-intentioned but ultimately impractical for restaurants operating on thin margins. She opened the folder, revealing documents that looked similar to the ones Janet had shown me that morning. What he didn't tell me was that his consulting fees were being paid by the same overseas manufacturers who would benefit from my switching suppliers. The conflict of interest was even more direct than I'd understood. Strategic Supply Solutions wasn't just advocating for imported alternatives. They were being paid by the companies that produced those alternatives. "How did you find out?" The news story prompted me to do research I should have done months ago. James Walsh's consulting firm has financial relationships with every overseas supplier they recommend. They're not providing objective advice, they're functioning as a sales force. Victoria's anger was palpable now, the kind of fury that comes from realizing you've been manipulated by people you trusted. "I built my restaurant group on relationships with local suppliers, on the idea that supporting Portland's food community was good business and good citizenship." Walsh convinced me that was naive sentimentality. She closed the folder with a snap that echoed my memory of our first meeting. "I want to make this right: the Thornfield project, the ceramic partnership, all of it. But I also want to make sure this doesn't happen to other business owners." The conversation that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced in 7 years of running my ceramic studio. Instead of discussing individual pieces or artistic vision, we talked about economic policy, community development, and the responsibility that successful businesses had to support the ecosystems that had enabled their success. "The partnership needs to be bigger than what we originally planned," Victoria said. "It needs to demonstrate that local collaborations aren't just artistically satisfying, they're economically superior to the alternatives Walsh was pushing." By the time we finished talking, the Thornfield project had evolved from a simple commission into something more ambitious: a comprehensive demonstration of how restaurants could build supply chains that strengthened local communities while delivering the quality and reliability that commercial operations require. The next morning brought a call from Marcus that I answered while wedging clay for the day's throwing session. "Have you seen the Journal this morning?" "Not yet." "Why?" Front page, business section. Local restaurant group expands artisan partnership. Victoria Thornfield gave them an interview about the expanded Thornfield project and her experience with Strategic Supply Solutions. I put him on speaker and continued working the clay, the familiar rhythm of preparation helping me process this latest development. The speed at which events were moving felt almost surreal, like watching a slow-motion avalanche suddenly accelerate. "There's more," Marcus continued. "3 other restaurant groups have called this morning wanting to discuss similar partnerships. The exposure from the news story has turned local artisan collaboration into a competitive advantage rather than a liability." The irony wasn't lost on me. Strategic Supply Solutions' campaign to discourage local partnerships had backfired spectacularly, creating exactly the kind of publicity and community support that made such collaborations attractive to business owners. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to my studio, Natalie, carrying what looked like a bottle of champagne, and wearing an expression I couldn't quite read. "I came to congratulate you," she said, setting the bottle on my work table, "and to apologize again, but more specifically this time." I cleaned clay from my hands, giving her my full attention. Our relationship had been shifting since her first apology, but this felt like another significant moment. "I've been thinking about what you said when this all started, about my work being pathetic, about needing to get a real job." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I realize now that I was projecting my own dissatisfaction with my career onto your success." The admission was more personal than anything she'd shared during our previous conversations. "What do you mean?" "I mean that watching you build something meaningful from scratch, something that connects you to your community and reflects your values, made me realize how empty my own professional achievements felt by comparison." She walked to the window, looking out at Hawthorne Street where the afternoon foot traffic was picking up as people finished their workday. "I've spent years climbing a corporate ladder toward goals that don't actually matter to me, telling myself that security and conventional success were more important than personal fulfillment." The vulnerability in her voice was new, the kind of honesty that had been missing from our relationship for years. "When I called your work pathetic, I was really calling my own choices pathetic. You had the courage to pursue something you believed in, while I was too afraid to risk conventional stability for authentic satisfaction." I joined her at the window, watching Portland's creative community go about its daily business, artists heading to studios, makers carrying supplies, people choosing to support local businesses rather than corporate alternatives. "It's not too late to make different choices," I said. Natalie smiled, though it carried hints of sadness. "Maybe not, but it would require the kind of courage you've been showing all along, the willingness to value meaningful work over safe work." We talked for another hour, the conversation meandering through childhood memories, career disappointments, and the different ways people define success. By the time she left, something fundamental had shifted between us, not back to the closeness we'd shared as children, but toward a mutual respect that felt more sustainable than forced family affection. That evening, Riley called with news that put the day's developments in broader perspective. "The Strategic Supply Solutions story is spreading beyond Portland," she said, excitement clear in her voice. "I've been getting calls from gallery owners and makers in Seattle, San Francisco, even some cities on the East Coast. Apparently, this kind of manipulation has been happening nationwide." The implications were staggering. What had seemed like a local business dispute was actually part of a much larger economic pattern, systematic efforts to break down the relationships between communities and the businesses that served them. "There's talk of organizing a response," Riley continued, "a network of cities working together to protect local business partnerships from this kind of interference." The idea of Portland leading a national movement to defend local economies against corporate manipulation was both thrilling and daunting. It suggested that the fight I'd stumbled into was much bigger than anything I'd imagined. 2 weeks later, I stood in the kitchen of Victoria Thornfield's newest restaurant, watching as her staff prepared for the dinner service, using the first completed pieces from the expanded ceramic partnership. The plates and bowls look different in this context than they had in my studio, surrounded by the energy and purpose of professional cooks turning ingredients into experiences. "They're perfect," Victoria said, running her finger along the rim of a soup bowl. "Exactly what I envisioned when I first heard about your work." The partnership had grown beyond even our revised plans. Instead of just providing tableware, my studio was now part of a comprehensive local sourcing initiative that included everything from specialty linens to custom furniture. Other ceramicists had joined the project, each contributing their unique skills while maintaining the collaborative spirit that made the work stronger than any individual effort. Marcus appeared beside us carrying a folder that had become familiar over the weeks of intensive planning. "The financial reports are remarkable," he said. "Customer satisfaction scores are up, social media engagement has tripled, and the cost per customer acquisition has actually decreased despite the higher supplier costs. The numbers validated what I'd believed all along, that authentic relationships between makers and users created value that couldn't be replicated by mass production, regardless of cost efficiencies. There's something else, Marcus continued. Strategic Supply Solutions announced this morning that they're closing their Portland office and discontinuing their restaurant consulting services in the Pacific Northwest. The news felt like a victory, though I knew it was probably more strategic retreat than actual defeat. James Walsh and his colleagues would likely surface in other markets with similar tactics, but their ability to operate in Portland had been effectively ended. That Saturday, I received a visit at the studio that completed the transformation that had begun with Natalie's dismissive comment about my pathetic work. Victoria Thornfield walked in carrying a manila envelope and wearing the kind of smile that suggested significant news. "I have a proposition," she said, settling into one of the chairs near my pottery wheel. "The Thornfield Group is expanding, opening locations in 3 other cities over the next 2 years. We want to establish artisan partnerships in each location, creating a network of local makers who can support authentic dining experience." She opened the envelope, revealing partnership agreements that would make my studio the consulting hub for a regional network of restaurant artisan collaborations. "We're offering you a position as Director of Artisan Relations for the entire Thornfield Group. You'd maintain your studio here in Portland, but you'd also be responsible for identifying and developing maker partnerships in our other markets." The offer was beyond anything I could have imagined when I'd first started throwing clay 7 years earlier. It represented not just financial success, but the opportunity to spread the collaborative model that had emerged from the Portland project to communities that could benefit from stronger relationships between makers and users. "There's one condition," Victoria continued. "We want Marcus and Henley and Associates to handle the marketing and business development for all the partnerships. This needs to be a 3-way collaboration between restaurants, artisans, and marketing professionals who understand how to present authentic relationships to broader audiences." I looked around my studio, at the space that had been home to years of patient work and gradual growth, the pottery wheel where I'd learned to center clay and center myself, the shelves crowded with pieces that told the story of my development as both artist and business owner, the kiln that had transformed thousands of pieces from fragile greenware into durable vessels for daily use. All of it would continue, but as part of something larger than I'd ever envisioned. The pathetic hobby that Natalie had dismissed was becoming the foundation for a business model that could support artisans throughout the region. "I accept," I said, though the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what was being offered. Victoria stood and extended her hand, and as we shook on the agreement, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The years of financial uncertainty and family disapproval, the gradual building of skills and reputation, the partnership with Marcus that had seemed like such a risk just months earlier. Most of all, I thought about the moment when Natalie had called my work pathetic, the comment that had sparked everything that followed. Her attempt to diminish what I'd built had instead forced me to defend it, to articulate its value in ways I'd never done before. That evening, I called Natalie to share the news about the Thornfield expansion and my new role. Her response surprised me with its genuine enthusiasm. "I'm proud of you," she said simply, "not just for the business success, but for proving that meaningful work and financial success aren't mutually exclusive. Thank you, that means more than you know." "There's something else," she said. "I've been doing some thinking about my own career, about what I actually want to be building toward." I waited, sensing that whatever came next would be important. "I'm considering leaving Henley and Associates to start my own consulting practice, focusing on helping traditional businesses develop authentic relationships with their communities. Kind of like what you and Marcus accomplished, but for different industries." The idea of Natalie launching her own venture, pursuing work that connected to her values, rather than just her salary requirements, felt like the completion of a circle that had started with her criticism of my choices. "I think that sounds like exactly the kind of work you should be doing," I said. 6 months later, I stood in a ceramic studio in Seattle, working alongside a local potter to prepare pieces for the newest Thornfield restaurant. The space was different from my Portland studio, larger and more modern, but but the fundamental satisfaction of shaping clay remained constant. The artisan relations network had grown beyond our initial projections, connecting makers throughout the Pacific Northwest with restaurants and retailers who valued handmade goods. The business model we'd developed in Portland was proving adaptable to different markets while maintaining the authentic relationships that made it successful. My phone buzzed with a text from Riley, who was in San Francisco helping to establish a similar program. The message included a photo of ceramicist, textile artist, and woodworkers collaborating on pieces for a restaurant group that had been inspired by our Portland example. The movement we'd started was spreading, creating economic opportunities for makers, while providing businesses with the authentic local connections their customers increasingly value. Strategic Supply Solutions and similar consulting firms still operated in many markets, but they now faced organized opposition from communities that understood the value of supporting local partnership. That evening I returned to Portland and my original studio, where the familiar smell of clay and the comfort of established routines welcomed me home. The space looked the same as it had a year earlier, but everything about its meaning had changed. The pottery wheel where I'd first learned to center clay was now the heart of a network that connected makers across multiple cities. The kiln that had fired my earliest experiments was part of a production capacity that served restaurants throughout the region. The small storefront that had once seemed barely sustainable was now the headquarters for a business model that was being studied and replicated in communities nationwide. As I prepared clay for the next day's work, I thought about the comment that had started everything: Natalie's dismissal of my pathetic hobby, and her suggestion that I needed to get a real job. The irony was that she'd been right in a way she hadn't intended. I did need a real job, and I'd found one by refusing to abandon the work I loved. The difference was that instead of conforming to someone else's definition of legitimate career success, I'd insisted on creating my own definition, one that honored both artistic integrity and business achievement. The clay beneath my hands was the same material I'd been working with for 7 years, but my relationship to it had evolved. It was no longer just the medium for individual artistic expression, it was the foundation for economic relationships that strengthened entire communities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to expand the network of makers and businesses that were proving authentic partnerships could thrive in competitive markets. But tonight I was simply a potter preparing for another day of transforming earth into vessels that would hold not just food and drink, but the connections that made communities worth preserving. The work continued, as it always had, one piece at a time, one relationship at a time, one community at a time, and somewhere in the process of defending what I'd built, I'd discovered that the most pathetic thing would have been to abandon it for someone else's version of success. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.